Okay. The end is near. How's everybody doing? How y'all doing? Who was there at Belly Up 2 weeks ago when we kicked this off with the dance part? It felt like 2 weeks ago, didn't it? How good was that? A lot of people were asking me actually which community in the OYF is the funkiest, and I'm just going to tell the truth. It was a tie between Buffalo and Del Norte tribal lands for the funkiest. Did you guys see Buffalo? They were out on the dance floor the entire time. I don't know if you, so who knew? I guess when you get snowed in for 3 months out of the year, you do a lot of dancing. Okay, so before we start this last incredible panel, we have a powerhouse panel to finish with. Shocker, that's what we do. I'm gonna invite our incredible partner, thought leader, transformative systems changer, Sean from Hawaii, to come up and do a grounding for us. Thank you, Sean. You come up.
Thank you, Steve. Okay. Aloha, everyone. All right, we made it this far. Thank you all for your gracious presence here. I was invited to share a grounding thought or two with you, maybe even some breathing. And so I immediately called my daughter. She's 23 years old, and I said, what should I do? And she said, mo'oku auhau consciousness. So I want to share with you this idea, this perspective that relates to our purpose here. And as we reflect on several themes that we've heard throughout the conference, love, as Monique always talks about, growth, opportunity, and amazing stories of progress everywhere in our communities, I want to share this worldview that we call mo'oku auhau consciousness. It's kind of hard to say unless you know the language, but you can say it, mo'oku auhau. Beautiful. See, you speak Hawaiian. All of you now speak Hawaiian. This worldview, it's about intergenerational responsibility. It embodies the interconnections that we have between people, all of us, our ancestors, the land, and it guides how we can work with purpose and foresight to empower present and future generations. And as our young people are always saying, the future is now. Mo'oku auhau translates in English to genealogy, but it's much more than that lineal, tracing your lineage. It's a consciousness, it's a way of living that connects individuals to our past, our heritage, and to the generations yet to come through our actions that take place today. It includes the natural world, our ancestral knowledge, and cultural wisdom, reminding us that the past and the future are deeply interconnected, intertwined. Mo'oku auhau consciousness is a commitment to preserve and build upon the gifts that we have been given, our knowledge, our culture, the magical lands that energize us here in this place. Somebody asked, what's the difference between Hawaii and Aspen? I said, well, they're both incredibly beautiful places to be. One's a little colder. Got my boots on today. I had sandals yesterday. And we do this, we bring these things together so that our future generations not only survive, but thrive. It aligns with other ancient teachings from the Iroquois people, from other native traditions that talk about the 7th generation principle. And this principle urges us to make decisions today, planning for 7 generations into the future. Imagine our descendants 7 generations from now may be sitting, I don't know if they'll be sitting or doing what they'll be doing, but what will they be talking about? Because what we do know that 7 generations from now, our descendants will be talking to each other. And hopefully we leave that legacy for them here today. As Tayayaki Alfred, a Mohawk scholar, put it, it is time for our people to live again, to transform society by recreating our existences, regenerating our cultures, and surging against the forces that keep us bound to our colonial past. This vision resonates across Indigenous cultures where identity is not only about the individual, but also about community, about ancestors, about descendants, all of our descendants. Mo'oku auhau consciousness teaches us that our choices and actions affect us affect more than just ourselves. They impact our community and the generations to come. And in our Native Hawaiian culture, Kanako Maoli culture, this understanding is not just a responsibility, it's a privilege and a commitment to ensure that our future generations inherit not just resources, but also wisdom, and as Judge Hall shared this morning, cultural resilience. Like our ancestors who acted with us in mind by taking that next step to record and preserve our knowledge for future generations. And by the way, in our culture, they did that orally. Everything that we know was passed down orally. We're called to lay today a foundation upon which others can build as they come. This foundation should be solid and enduring, and as one of our elders, Uncle Larry Kimura, says, we're now relaying the huge foundation stones that become the hale, the house, that our descendants will live in and work from. So this idea of intergenerational responsibility isn't only for Indigenous peoples, it's for all of us. It's a call to action. All of us, as Indigenous peoples, we've resisted efforts to exterminate us from the planet, but we're not giving up, and neither are all of us in this room. We're working together to continue forward against resistance. And I encourage all of us to reflect on what that means in your own context. Probably that context looks really different from Aspen. Our current paths, whether in designing programs with learning in mind, like Dr. Cantor urged us to do, whether we work to reform education or criminal systems, whether we drive policy and innovation and fund that to make things happen, we each impact the world that our future generations will inherit. It's a kind of a powerful thing to think about. Mo'oku Auhau consciousness asks us to look beyond today and to protect and honor the resources, knowledge, and cultural legacies that are crucial for long-term well-being so that our families and our communities will have these foundations to thrive. And in a world often driven by short-term needs, goals, and outcomes, think about what we measure, adopting Mo'oku Auhau consciousness can guide us towards sustainable, positive change. As scholar Noi Noi Silva puts it, this view is not static, but it's constantly formed in relation to our land and our ancestors. It's a dynamic process that emerges as we engage with our past and the needs of the present, many challenges to deal with. We're each called upon in this room here to exercise a form of intellectual and cultural sovereignty, a refusal to let external forces drive or define the value of our traditions and what we hold dear, or the direction of the future. We define the future. So to conclude, let us gather our shared commitment to ensuring that our actions today resonate positively for generations to come. Let us think of ourselves as voyagers, sailing in the wake of our ancestors who had the foresight to think about and the courage to think about the future that we now share today. And by embracing the teachings of Mo'oku Auhau consciousness and the seventh generation principle, we can create a world where our children and their children will inherit both our resilience and vision for a better world. So I invite you, I'll ask you to take a breath in a few minutes of breathing in and out this resolution together as we prepare for the closing session, which is going to be awesome. And we'll take 3 breaths, reflecting our resolve. 1, that we will make decisions that honor the past. 2, that we reimagine a better present and create it. And 3, that we empower a positive future. I'll say hanu mai, which is to breathe in, and then I'll say hanu aku, which is to breathe out 3 times. You ready? Okay. Hanu mai. Hold it. Hanu aku. Hanu mai. Hanu aku. Last time. Hanu mai. Hanu aku. That was a deep sea dive on that one. Mahalo, everybody.
Mahalo, Sean. That last one at Elevation. If she had done that on day one, I don't know if we'd all been able to reopen our eyes. Okay, up next, how awesome is Meta for Houston, huh, you guys? So you already know, as Jamil would say, you already know. So I'm going to invite Jaden to come up and share some poetry with us. Thank you, Jaden.
Thank you. First, I want to shout out the Aspen Institute for giving me this kind of opportunity. They're few and far between, and I appreciate them every time. I also want to thank my coach, Outspoken Bean. I can't find him right now. He's right over there. Oh, there he is. I want to thank my coach, Outspoken Bean. He helped me develop my voice a lot when I was younger. I was on the team 2 years in 2016 and 2018. And I'm so grateful for what I got to experience there. So I would like to share with you a letter for my imaginary son in the year 2034. If you scroll real far down a white person's Instagram page, you will probably find a black square. I need to explain what that means. We are always dying. We are sometimes the topic of dinner table discussion. Other times, we are corpses they are numb to. Old news. A faded BLM sticker on the back of their Subaru. I want to be clear, when it comes to white people, it's not the white that's the problem, it's the people. They do care, but there's a chasm. We really don't bleed the same. Our blood spills. Their blood, at best, will boil, and then simmer, and then sit comfortable at 98 degrees. That's the thing about heat. They can carry it, but I need you to keep it cool. Especially if you get pulled over. No side eyes, no snarky comments. Keep both your hands on the wheel. Move real slow. Don't look like you're reaching for something. Because they will reach for something. You know how the pen is mightier than the sword? The gun is both. Both the law and its incineration. Both the murder and the eulogy. A blood-splattered canvas is just a canvas. They can still paint you the villain. History is written by the gunslingers. Whoever draws first decides who drew first. A broken taillight can turn to felony possession in the blink of an eye, so I pray you don't get caught. I'm praying and I don't even know if God exists, but the devil does. I've met his advocates. I've seen his sympathizers. There is no footage you can capture that will convert them. Son, I love you. I hope you're meek. I'm sorry you have to see this.
Okay, you guys ready to hit your spots? Come on up. Thank you. Again, I hate choking up before we even start the panel, but thank you. That was powerful. Really appreciate it, Jaden. All right, let's get the rest of this party started, or let's close it out. So we're going to have a conversation about sort of the moment we're in, and also about philanthropy and about how we collectively would like to see things shift. That's sort of, I think, what this conversation is going to be about, but we don't really know until we have the conversation. And so I'm going to start by just asking each of my panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Steve all the way down, share a little bit about yourself and your work, and then we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to start asking questions I probably won't start with zodiac sign. It'll be a little deeper than that. But feel free to share your zodiac sign if that's part of who you are. But please, each of you, if you wouldn't mind, just share who you are and how you're here. Starting with Steve. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I want to honor and thank that poem, which I think really grounded us, and I'm not sure we have much to say after that, frankly. I'm Steve Phillips. I live in San Francisco. Grew up in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, literally a child of the civil rights movement. I'm a writer and have been and am a philanthropist with my late wife, Susan Sandler. Try to bring all those lessons together in terms of trying to carry on that work around manifesting a better world so that future letters we write to our imaginary children will be different.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you all. I'm Brenda Onabaro, Vice President of Learning and Community Engagement at the Inatai Foundation, and I'll share more about our work in a minute, but it's been really beautiful to be here with you all these last few days. And I'm a Capricorn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Smith Arriaga. I'm the Vice President of Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. I live in Austin, Texas, and yay, go Austin. I'm also a Cancer, but I like to say that I'm a researcher by training, but an advocate by blood, so super excited to be here today.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Deanna Musso. I'm from the Kuichasho Oyate and Oglala Sioux tribe. Super happy to be here today. I'm a former Native youth grantmaker with Native Americans in Philanthropy. Super honored to be here and speak with the panelists, so thank you.
It's good to hear Nap get a shout out. We love Native Americans in Philanthropy. I'm going to start down with Steve, and let me just share that part of why we invited Steve was this provocative piece that he co-authored in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. For those of you who don't know, all the CEOs in philanthropy read the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So because sometimes people are like, who gives a damn that something's in the Stanford? Well, it is really an opportunity to influence the field. And we liked what Steve was trying to say to the field. So if you haven't seen it, you can catch it online. It's entitled Strategic Philanthropy Has Failed. What's next? And so that's part of the background on Steve. And then we got to know who he was. Like, damn. So you all got the book, right? So he's the author of this book. Check out his podcast, which is quite remarkable. He was pretty, I think, moved by the poem such that he told you who he was rather than all the things he's done. But he's done some cool stuff. So, Steve, I want to start with the article. Essentially, your call to the social sector is that we need to see greater investment in democracy. Talk about this piece that you wrote with Mark Kramer. Share with us kind of your thoughts behind it and what you were trying to get to by putting it out there.
Well, I would say there's three fundamental points I would want to convey, right? What does leadership look like? Power, not persuasion. And democracy towards impacting and influencing government as a leverage and a strategic point where we actually go for. So just a couple things on each of those. So what does leadership look like? We are, and I'm well aware we're a 501c3 gathering, but we are, 5 days away from, we have had 46 presidents in this country. All of them men. 45 of them white men. There is a picture of what leadership looks like in this country. It does not look like an African American and Asian woman. And that is what is partially being tested, both in terms of played out, but also reacted against within this country. So that's playing itself out in the context in which we gather. And I also think it plays itself out in terms of philanthropy and in terms of many of these different circles and donor circles. So I've been privileged to be in the spaces. So my in-laws were major philanthropists. I was part of the very original gatherings this country had in 2004, 2005, where a lot of the different progressive donors came together to try to coordinate their efforts. And I actually chaired the investment committee for this one entity, the Democracy Alliance, that was the first and only national gathering of major philanthropists. And I can tell you with great certitude that the picture of leadership that most people in philanthropy have does not look like the people within this room. And so this is the first point that I wanted to move forward. This is what I tried to lay out in my book. As I looked at, somebody asked me what I was most excited about in reading the book, and I thought about it, and I was like, for my whole life, again, I said I was child of civil rights movement, born in 1964, same year as Kamala Harris, that people have always said, yes, this people of color thing is important, but we have to win. So the issues of people of color have to take a back seat. And I was like, wait a minute, we're winning. We've won in Georgia. We've won in Harris County, Texas. We've won in San Diego. We've won in Arizona. So let's talk about what it takes to win. And that's the second half of the book, is laying out these case studies of these places, including Virginia, that were former bastions of the Confederacy. Virginia, the literal capital of the Confederacy, have now been transformed to the point where an African American is the leader of the state house within the state of Virginia. What is required? All of those efforts have been driven by people of color, mainly women of color, who don't necessarily fit that profile. So I think as philanthropists and also as people who are trying to advance change, we have to grapple with that concept. Second is this issue around persuasion and not power. And it's interesting even gathering here, right? There's it's very much in the DNA of Aspen Institute that find common ground, intellectual discussion and debate will enable us to find this common ground. There's this assumption, and actually it's even interesting, people lift up Abraham Lincoln. I think Lincoln was this great model of how do we actually, bring people together, a cabinet of rivals. And we all know Lincoln was assassinated, but we don't know, I didn't know, exactly when and exactly why. So the Civil War ostensibly ended on Sunday in April of 1865. And that Tuesday, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House portico talking about limited voting rights for African Americans in Louisiana. John Wilkes Booth was there, turns to the person next to him and says, "That means nigger citizenship." That is the last speech he will ever give. That Friday, Booth went into the Ford Theater and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. I say that to say the first part of my book, I try to lay out how the Civil War has never actually ended. Mm-hmm. And we did not end slavery in this country through dialogue. Mm-hmm. It ultimately took a struggle, and it took a question of how do you manifest power in this situation. So I can talk later about some of the work that I've done in philanthropy in terms of, that'll be the segue, in terms of the work in Georgia, that my wife was the first national donor to back Stacey Abrams in 2011. Stacey came to us and says, there are 1 million eligible unregistered voters of color in Georgia. I'm going to register them to vote. And we were like, let's go. And so we backed Stacey. Part of that work was validating and vouching for her in philanthropic circles. People did not see her as the kind of leader who was the kind of brilliant leader, the kind of person they should get behind. You're not used to seeing, there's a reason this country has never in its history elected a black woman as governor. And it's not because they're not smart. Our picture of leadership does not include dark-skinned black women with a gap in their teeth. We have to move beyond that conception. But we got behind Stacey, worked with her around this over the course of a decade, registering voters, changing the composition of the electorate, and moving towards impacting government, manifesting the full power of our democracy, moving philanthropic dollars, in our case, some non-philanthropic dollars, but also initially philanthropic dollars, a 501c3 effort that we began with her in 2013. That work led to Georgia sending to the United States Senate the first Jewish American senator from Georgia, and the literal successor to Martin Luther King Jr., who preaches from the pulpit in Ebenezer Baptist Church where Dr. King preached, went to the United States Senate, changed the composition of the Senate, changed the priorities of the Senate so that then trillions of dollars could flow, so that Ketanji Brown Jackson could then be appointed to the Supreme Court. That was an example of a philanthropic investment focused on the right leader, focused on power and not persuasion, and focused on impacting government to be able to get government to be truly responsive to the multiracial majority that exists. So I would say that's kind of the essence of what I'm trying to convey in that.
That's really, there's a lot to unpack there. I think, so 10 years of investment in Stacey Abrams. For those of you who received grants, how many of you had 10 years of investment from a particular philanthropy? So that's good. Geneva Wiki got 10 years. All right, there we go. So best practice, I would say, something we can strive for. I think civic infrastructure, you're speaking to the need for that to drive change at a systemic level. I think that's really important. Steve, I want to come back to you because I think you've been talking about this being an inflection moment. This is your first time back at Aspen in how long?
A decade.
A decade. So I want to come back to you on that, but I think since we're on the topic of investing in civic infrastructure, much of what you also are talking about is trust-based philanthropy. How many of you have heard this term, trust-based philanthropy? Yeah, it's good news. It's funny because it seemed to peak, unfortunately, and you all should push back on us. Seemed like when COVID hit, oh my God, the trust was beautiful. Like, how many of you got like your program office was like, we don't care, do whatever you want with the money, we trust you, just survive, right? Just survive, right? And it just felt like, oh, okay. And then, you guys tell me, those of you who received grants, sort of like 10 minutes after I got the vaccine, it was like, where are the outcomes we purchased? No, that's probably not fair. But Brenda, you all are trying to do, if you can talk about the foundation, it's where it emerged from, and what you're trying to do that's different, that actually builds on what Steve just shared.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say for folks that are like me and a little bit have come to philanthropy in the last few years, just naming what a giant Steve is, because he doesn't, just saying like we funded Stacey Abrams. Nobody was funding Stacey Abrams at that time. And now every funder's like, oh, yeah, let me get in on that. And so I just want to say thank you because our work wouldn't be possible without the bravery of yours. So thank you for that. So I'll say a couple of things about who we are and how we do our work before I dive into some specifics. One, we're a 501c4 foundation. And for folks who are new to what that means, that just means our tax status allows us to both do explicitly political work and fund explicitly political work. But I'm going to caveat that with saying, and it's not an accident that most of the organizations that exist in the United States are C3s and have limitations on that. That's a political, that was planned. Our organizations should be challenging power. And so I just want to name that because I think that's important for. The other thing to say is that nearly 80, I think it's like 85% of our dollars go to BIPOC-led organizations. That means led both in leadership and in board. And then 95% of our funds are unrestricted and multi-year. I'm naming those two things because I think a lot of times when we say who we are as a foundation, that we're a C4, C3 funders kind of will sit back and be like, oh, well, this maybe, what she's gonna say might exclude us because we have limitations on either our family foundation or how we do our work. But those two things, both doing unrestricted multi-year funding and funding predominantly BIPOC-led organizations, the ability to do that means we're actually not funding largely C4 work. Because, as I said before, it's not an accident that most organizations are C3s. You become a C3 because you're trying to access C3 dollars. And so we're funding organizations that we know are on a path, and some of them have always been doing political work. They can't maybe go to a certain extent into electoral work. They have to be careful about that. But what we do is we say we're going to fund the whole ecosystem And we're going to get folks C4 curious and beyond. Some folks are interested in doing that work. Some folks are clear with us they're never going to do that work for a variety of reasons, and that's okay. We still believe in building up an infrastructure. And so I just wanted to name that. So a lot of what I'm going to speak to, any foundation could fund and could do because we are funding a lot of folks who have limitations in their work. So we got started 6 years ago. I think it's important to name the amount of dollars we have. We have $2.5 billion. It was a sale of a health cooperative to a private health company. We're no longer attached to any of that, so we're completely private. I think it's important to name money because a lot of times, especially in like owning class circles, you clutch your pearls and you're like, we don't talk about money. But this is people's money, and so we should name it, and folks should know, oh, okay, that means I'm gonna do the calculation on like how much they're putting out. So we're putting out about $80 million a year in the state of Washington, I should name that too. So we fund primarily in Washington state, beyond that as well. And we basically got, when we started 6 years ago, me and our CEO were the only 2 staff. Now we're at about 65. We went around the state, we still do this now, it's gonna be a forever work. Sat in carving sheds, met with tribal council leadership, I would call up people and be like, we're a new foundation. People would hang up on me because they thought, nobody ever reached out to them before. But we've done that and we keep doing that and saying, what do you all need from this foundation? What are you trying to build? Over time, we heard folks really being clear, and this became our mission, that we need to help transform the balance of power for racial justice in Washington state. And so that means funding an ecosystem. Similar to what Pamela Cantor was saying on Monday, we know that organizations have the capacity and the ability, but there's not the conditions a lot of times to allow that work. So we asked then, well, what's our role? Like, what are the conditions that, and we've been asking these questions, that you all need to be able to really shift that power? What does it mean for you to build community power, to build expressly political power? The 4 things that we've kind of distilled down from all of that listening and all of what we keep hearing is freedom, the freedom to care for our communities, the freedom to access public dollars, connection, the ability to have each other's back when things get hard, the ability to bring more people in, influence. Organizations need political influence. They need to be seen as powerful. I'm forgetting one, ownership, and the ability to own our own spaces, the ability to own the narrative. And so those are the things that we are as a foundation helping to support. We do that then by saying and we had this conversation earlier about strategic versus, we see our work as very strategic. And so it's just, we don't tell people what to do. But we said then, well, what is our role as a funder to help support the conditions for you to organize in that way, to build freedom, to build your capacity to have all those things. And the 5 roles that we play are, 1, we use our capital leverage. We do work in the markets, and we also manage other foundations' investments to really compound that dollars for racial justice. We also see our work, we step into our influence. We don't shy away from it. We know that as a foundation, we have that influence, but it has to be in service of the organizations we fund, so we're clear about that. The bread and butter of our work is funding organizations, and we primarily fund community organizing. That's so important. We fund other parts of the ecosystem, like research, legal, narrative, but we're always clear that all of those entities should be really orienting their work in service of community organizing efforts for racial justice. And then lastly, our two final roles are actionable information and providing any research we do. The questions have to be coming from community. Usually it's tied to the policy agenda that we're forwarding. That's part of the organizations we work with. And then finally, it's about building the power building infrastructure of the state, because we don't want to fund at election cycles. We have to fund long term. But that means really finding out, and this is work we're just entering, because I mentioned we're only 6 years old, but saying, what does it look like to provide concrete infrastructure in our state? Because some organizations might come online for a short period. They might stay 10 plus years, but what does it mean to provide the kind of supports that we need to increase our democracy in our state and beyond? So,
wow, that's awesome. So much in that. There's a lot of trust in the way you show up with organizations. Are there any C4s in the room? Anybody affiliated with a C4 or connected to a C4? Do we all understand? I'm gonna make a couple of other connections and then come back to you to just say, give us one C4 you're funding. So you can think about that. Healthcare Conversion Foundation. Who here either has received money from a healthcare conversion foundation or worked for one or works for one? There's the folks from Ohio are running a healthcare conversion foundation. Geneva used to work for the California Endowment. You guys get money from the Headwaters Fund, and and it seems like that's an interesting thing, because I just named 3 foundations that actually do pretty damn good practice when it comes to supporting the civic infrastructure necessary to transform the systems and structures we're all working to transform. So it's interesting to me that actually these foundations that don't come from super rich old people, old white guys usually, who died a while ago, they seem to have more barriers. And part of what we talked about in prepping for this is, like, somehow in the last decade or two, probably the last 2 decades, philanthropy seems to have gone into this hyper-strategic mode. The continuum of doing, charity, that's cool. But when charity transitioned into a notion of philanthropy, solving problems at the core, at the root, working upstream, that's a good idea. Strategic philanthropy, okay, all right, we can accept that. But this time we're in now, where so many philanthropies are actually now saying, how are you fitting into our metrics? We're the ones who measure change. You don't measure change, we measure. How do we adjust and think about that? It seems like this trend in conversion foundations, that just came to me, is one. Talk about a C4 that you fund so folks can really wrap their arms around that strategy.
Yeah, and I'll talk about one that's actually a C3 and a C4, because a lot of times you see an organization do
Even
both.
better.
Yeah, some people are doing LLCs now, which I love also. There's an organization called Ea Adelante, and they're a pretty new organization in Yakima, and actually for folks from Washington State, in the lower valley, actually, like Sunnyside. And they're amazing, and they started organizing women, but they organized the whole community, Latino community, and this is a predominantly Latino part of our state. We have majority people of color populations, and what they've done over time with partnership of other organizations is, one, there was litigation around the legislative districts. And so part of their work over time with other partners had been to really shape this district to make sure that their voting power could show up, and that was really important. So we will fund the litigation efforts around voting rights, but we also fund their day-to-day organizing. To be able to put your name as a plaintiff on a case is so brave, especially in certain parts of our state. So we'll fund some of that work, because we can usually get other funders to fund litigation is kind of sexy for funders. So we'll be like, we'll fund the organizing because nobody wants to fund that. But then they also are flexing. They support candidate work. There's some local ballot initiatives that they're involved in. There's also some no campaigns. We have so many ballot initiatives in Washington State, but there is some campaigns to repeal work, so they're on the no side of that, so we'll fund those efforts for them. So that's C4 work allows you to do things like ballot initiatives, campaigns, independent expenditures, and they're very careful about, like, okay, we're using our C4 hat for this, we'll use your dollars for this work, we'll use another funders for our C3, which is more education and voter mobilization.
Jump in, Steve.
Can I just do a 30-second addendum to this? Because I think people do say, like, well, C4, we don't do C4. Yeah. Most C4s also have a C3 arm. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't do C4 funding, if you fund a C3 that has a C4 arm, it makes more possible for that organization to do with its C4 dollars. So that's a way of having a C4 lens, even if your money has to go in the C3 direction.
Yeah, so for those of you who are out there trying to make change in community, if there's, like, if 2 of y'all started C4s as a result of this session, that would be cool. If all of y'all found ways to partner with those who are thinking across the different mechanisms that are at their disposal to make change, those are key partners in the work to build a more equitable and just society. And I think that's really important. Let's come back to trust-based philanthropy, because Alicia, we've been in this together for a while. So somehow I lost all my hair during the course of that. But when we reconnected, one of the things we reconnected around was your leadership, leading all of this learning at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. By the way, the Center for Effective Philanthropy's founder had a response to the piece that Steve and Mark wrote. This got controversial, y'all, so check it out. Don't just read the article, read the rebuttals from the institutions. And I don't have a horse in the race, but Strategic philanthropy has failed. But but Alicia, when we got together on a Zoom, you had just finished this incredible deep dive on Mackenzie Scott's grant making. Everybody know Mackenzie Scott? Raise your hand if you. Does anybody actually know Mackenzie Scott? Because I'd like to meet her. No. Anybody here get some money from Mackenzie Scott? Oh, good. That's beautiful, right? That's the civic infrastructure. That's trust-based philanthropy. Sometime I'll tell you about the time I almost got fired at the Gates Foundation for proposing my own philanthropy called No Strategy Inc., where I wanted them to, but then Mackenzie did it. I asked the Gates Foundation to let me leave with $200 million so I could launch No Strategy Inc. and prove that having no strategy had a greater impact than actually the over-engineered strategies we were pushing out to the world. I didn't get fired, but they didn't give me $200 million. But then Mackenzie Scott went out and did it at a grand level. I don't even know how many billions she's pushed out. So we got on this Zoom because you were about to release this report on the impact of her trust-based giving. And I was like, please tell me it's good news, right? And your short answer was, it is good news. But if you don't mind, feel free to do a little plug if you want about CEP, et cetera. But can we get into what happened with that money? What has gone on in the field as a result of her trust-based grant making?
Yeah, so much has happened since Mackenzie Scott started giving funds in 2020. And just to talk a little bit about why the Center for Effective Philanthropy even started to look at this is, there are not many, even though there are a lot of people who have folks heard of the Giving Pledge, where they're like, all these people, right? They're like, we're gonna give away all our money. Some people have started to do that.
Let's just name what it is. The Giving Pledge is billionaires saying they will give away at least half of their wealth by the time they die or upon their death. And it's something that Warren Buffett started with the Gateses. Sorry.
Yes, no, that's perfect. Yes. And Mackenzie Scott is one of those folks. And she's one of the few who has really stood true to that commitment. And so what that's looked like, and that I can show some slides, but I'm happy to just talk through it too, whichever is more. But CEP, basically, we wanted to understand, what's the impact of doing that level of giving? So Mackenzie Scott's given $17 billion since 2020. That's more than the total size of many foundations' entire endowments. Most of those gifts have been between $500,000 and up to $30 million. And the size of those gifts have been, on average, 80% of the organization's total operating budget. Who here has gotten a grant that's 80% of your operating budget? All right, there's one person, right? Maybe you were also a Scott people. Right, exactly. So when we talk about how these gifts are fundamentally different than than grants that organizations usually receive, one is we can see, right, they're much larger in size. The typical grant that an organization receives from a funder, in CEP, we have data from 20 years from grantees on the size of grants that their funders traditionally give. Those grants are typically $150,000. That's a huge difference from the average $5 million grant that Mackenzie Scott was giving right over the last 3 years. When we also look, secondly, at the restrictions on these grants, the grants that CEP studied, now Mackenzie Scott has done this in a lot of different ways. Two of the major ways that folks know about are a lot of people just got a call one day and they said, hey, we're from Mackenzie Scott's team and we're giving you a grant for $5 million. Those are the grants that we studied. There's a whole separate process that was done through Lever for Change that was an open call where anybody could apply to receive a grant from Scott. Those grants we have not studied. But the ones where folks just got this call, which is over 2,000 organizations, those grants came with few people, no people actually, filled out an application to receive those grants, right? Maybe they were asked to submit a strategy they had in place or look at their website or their budget, but they weren't spending hours filling out grant applications. Our data shows that on average, grantees spend up to 30 hours completing grant applications. to receive a grant for $150,000. That's a huge difference, right? So the size of the grant, the application requirements, the reporting requirements is the other thing that was really different. Most grants, of course, have some sort of reporting requirement that we also know takes a lot of time to complete. Mackenzie Scott told grantees who received these calls, the only reporting requirement that's necessary is none for most people. Just spend the funds in ways that you think are responsible. And then the fourth way that these grants are really different, which who here has ever received a grant where there was no timeline on when you had to spend it?
Wow.
Just the Mackenzie Scott.
Just the Mackenzie Scott grant. So, imagine receiving this infusion of capital, and then you could truly decide as an organization how you were going to spend it, what you were going to spend it on. And so CEP, we started studying these grants 2 years ago. Actually, in February, we'll release the third year of the study. But what I can share with you today are 4 big highlights from year 2, which we published last year. And I don't think these will be surprising to many folks in this room, but we surveyed all 1,500 organizations that have received funds as of last summer. Then we followed up with interviews with 40 of those organizations. And then we interviewed 40 funders to understand, like, Mackenzie Scott's giving away $17 billion. That's a lot of money. Is that impacting how other funders are thinking about their giving? And the 4 things that we learned are these. 1, that organizations are receiving these funds and they are doing all sorts of innovative things that are impacting communities. People talked about changing the amount of folks they serve. One organization talked about serving 5,000 folks who were unstably housed and then receiving this infusion of cash and then being able to serve 50,000 people. So just the sheer impact of what folks are able to do in their communities is huge. The second thing that we're learning from this data is that it's totally shifting organizational culture and how leaders are viewing their own leadership. So a lot of folks talked about instituting 401ks for the first time in their nonprofit so that people could have retirement plans. Being able to actually increase salaries, things they wanted to do forever, but it's hard to do that if you have a restricted grant, right, that says you can only do certain things. But they were able to finally increase salaries for staff. Over 40% of folks talked about increasing their reserves as an organization or starting an endowment. And so really focusing on these internal culture pieces were another big part. One of the third things we found, which was really interesting in these interviews with funders, is that although funders are excited about what Scott is doing and they find it intriguing, overall, funders have not really been moved in terms of changing their own practice to match what she's doing. And there were a lot of questions around the leadership of organizations, whether they're capable of actually absorbing this level of funds. But then we see in the fourth finding that actually over 90% of organizations say that receiving a gift of this size actually made their fundraising easier. Because then they were able to show to other funders, hey, someone else has invested in us in this way. Or leaders talked about it helped them say, wait, I can ask people for bigger grants, or I should be asking for more unrestricted funding. And so there's a real power in this kind of giving to really give organizations the flexibility to make the changes they really seek to make.
That's great. So another thing, if some of you start C4s, awesome. And if some of you go back to the funder community in your hometowns and say, hey, how about what Mackenzie Scott did? This is what I need. You know, years ago, there was a famous rabble-rouser in the philanthropy world, a guy who ran the Center for Community Change forever, Pablo Eisenberg. Some of the OGs in the room will know about Pablo. And he used to famously do different things. He famously would get a grant. How many of you applied for a grant before and then got half of what you asked for? That's literally 67% of the room. Pablo would call up the foundation CEO and go, you hear me? I'm tearing up the check. I wanted 200 grand and I'm not taking this check. And he really would push back. And I think Mackenzie Scott, the evidence, and go to the CEP website and look at this, but it gives us some agency to push back around what we really need to win in our work versus the power imbalance that we know is so real in the social sector between philanthropy and grant seekers. Tell us one example, Alicia, of one organization that kind of rock and rolled with the Mackenzie grant.
So one organization that we have talked a lot with is the Oakland Reach. And they work with parents across Oakland. During the pandemic, they founded a literacy program in an area of Oakland that worked really explicitly with parents and families and was able to increase literacy rates in that area. And in talking with the leader there, she said we never would have been able to shift what we were doing so quickly if we didn't have these flexible funds that, we weren't tied to doing a certain kind of programming. And so it really allowed them to shift what they were doing and change their whole model. And she talks about also how it's led to them asking for larger grants from other funders too.
That's great. And Oakland Reach, I know we've lifted up in our belonging, meaning, well-being, and purpose work. Okay, well, let's hear from another organization that has gotten Mackenzie Scott money. Eric Stegman, Native Americans in Philanthropy. We love that organization, and Deanna has been, now she's all grown up, but she was a youth grant maker. Is that fair to say? I mean, we're all, well, other than myself, everybody on this panel has grown up. Talk about your experience as someone who got to do grant making on the ground. And also, if you have reactions to what you've heard from others, feel free. That's the privilege of being last in the row. So really want to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. Well, to my understanding, to speak on the Mackenzie Scott funding, was that it really gave organizational security to the organization and more capacity to do things that, they may have not been able to do with other funding. But I guess to just kind of like reflect on my experience as a Native youth grant maker, I think it's important that funding gets directed to more of those capacity building and professional development programs for Native youth, and really just any marginalized youth. I think it would, excuse me, lost my train of thought.
One question I have, and I'm sorry, I didn't ask a great question, so I apologize. I asked you like 4 questions, and 2 of them were only half questions. So one question I have is, tell us about how you got invited to be a part of a program where the young people actually get to do the grant making. Tell us how you then reviewed, thought about those proposals, and then how you took on the responsibility, it's kind of a heavy responsibility, deciding who to fund and why. Just tell us a little bit about what you went through in becoming a grant maker.
Yeah, so through our experience with the Native Youth Grant Makers program, we were able to participate in NVR's grant review process. And it was really a unique and special experience. Just me, myself, being, an Indigenous person coming from the reservation and reviewing all these applications that were nonprofits, serving the reservation, serving Indigenous communities. And so I did take that responsibility very seriously, and so did, the other cohort members. But I think what was unique about it was, I guess, really getting to see their stories in the applications. We got, kind of like a long list, but there was very special stories. But I think, what I guess made it a different experience was taking it further and looking at these nonprofits, like their social medias, their newsletters, or like the extra stuff they submitted aside from, just their apps, which, they were allowed to do. So I think just getting to know more about them outside of what they put, in their application, and taking that initiative to see look at their Instagram, these awesome, they're doing all these activities with the youth. It's really grassroots effort. So I think that's what kind of made it a really special experience for me.
That's great. And NVR's Native Voices Rising, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the youth grant making program. Just one organization that stood out to you. Is there one that you got to be a part of funding that you just want to bring into the room for us?
Yeah, sure. An example I can think of, and I apologize, I don't recall the name of their nonprofit. It's been kind of couple of years, but they were trying to do like an LGBTQ powwow for the youth. And in their application, they wrote that they kind of struggled to find funding specifically for that, or there wasn't, a lot of resources out there available for that. And I guess on my end, like what I did do was go and look at their Instagram and see they are doing like all this cool stuff, regardless of they say their needs aren't being met. So that was like for me something I really wanted to strongly advocate for when we were in our different groups of reviewing. And so I guess like when that one came up, I was able to voice and advocate for them.
That's awesome. I love that. And it's like when in doubt, give it to the young people, right? And philanthropy, there's all this, well, what was your process for due diligence? Well, you actually went out and looked at their Instagram and figured out that they had strengths. In philanthropy, we're trying to get philanthropy to be strengths-based. You were like, oh, they're saying they can't get money, but we're gonna invest in the strength I saw from my due diligence. That's seasoned grant making. That is good grant making. So thank you for sharing the example so we could unpack it a little. I feel like
Steve, can I just add also an example, please. I think, because I think a lot of people think like, oh, youth funding or native funding, that's a separate thing and we'll try to carve out an extra thing over here on the side. But fundamentally, if we're talking about democracy work in a multiracial democracy, who actually has the knowledge and expertise to be able to unlock the potential power that exists? So I talk in my first book, there's this woman, Rita Hamida, who's an Arab American in California. She was working on a civic engagement campaign. She asked the people running that campaign for a list of Arab voters in Orange County, California. They gave her a list of 600 people. She says, let me go into the database. And she knew what to look for, country of origin, last name. She found 65,000 people. And so that enabled that whole piece to move forward. Looking then, we're days away from this election in Arizona. Super close election in 2020 in Arizona. There was specific work driven by the Native community to find and increase and bring more people into the civic engagement process. The increase in the Native American turnout in Arizona, just the increase in the Native American was larger than the margin of difference in 2020. So these communities, these voices, it's not a separate thing. It really needs to be core to transforming the democracy.
That's so good, and that's exactly, Steve, where I was going. Like, I feel like we're talking about how do we work in a democracy to grow a multicultural democracy, assuming we can continue to live in a democracy. Assuming we think we will.
Check back on Tuesday.
So I don't want to depress anybody, but I wanted to go there, Steve, with you, because I think you've talked about being at an inflection point. Just say a little more about this moment we're in right now, from your vantage point, all the work you're doing on growing a multicultural democracy.
Well, I think everybody realizes what the stakes are. I would one of the things that, there's two things that have been stuck in my mind. One is how much we're risking normalizing extraordinarily aberrant behavior. And that people talk about like, well, there's this over here and there's this over there. And then there's like the pushback that you actually get. So there was this rally in Madison Square Garden with this extraordinarily unapologetic racist attacks and comments being made this past week. And then some people were interspersing. So there is a documentary film, 7 minutes long, called A Night at the Garden by Marshall Curry. He did the documentary on Cory Booker's mayoral run, Street Fight. And it's 7 minutes of footage at a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, 1939, that had 20,000 people there. And so one of these mainstream iconic institutions having this level of unapologetic white nationalist fascist politics, and then we had this past week. But much of the conversation is like, well, there's that over there and there's this over here. And so we run the risk of normalizing. And so I think that's an important thing for us to realize is the stakes of what we're facing. The other main point I think is important to hold for this moment, well, one is another point about this piece around the expertise. So after Biden stepped down, Harris shot up in the polls, then you had the New York Times, the daily podcast, you had the white host talking to their white political person, trying to understand this phenomenon of what's going on with Kamala Harris. if you don't have expertise and understanding to the history of people of color and women of color in this country and why people were so enthusiastic, you're not going to understand what's actually going on. So you have that whole dynamic. But I think the last thing is to think about, also back to power, not persuasion. I'm of an age, in 1987, Gary Hart was the front runner from the Democratic Party running for president and had to drop out of the race because he was caught having an affair, a consensual affair. And it was too big a scandal for him to continue his candidacy. And now we're facing an election where somebody who has been 34 felony convictions, civilly found of rape, who has been impeached twice and who has been federally indicted for insurrection, has an unshakable 47% support. And so this concept around we are not going to persuade people, I guess that's my last point around this, is that I feel confident, I'm a Democrat, I feel confident that those who want a multiracial democracy are actually going to prevail next week. But I think if we do, we are going to have been extraordinarily lucky. Because the other forces, Donald Trump is not a serious man. He's not a disciplined person. He's not aggressive and meticulous and organized. And he's been able to find and to see what the floor is to white nationalism in this country and just ride that and just cavalierly throw this thing out and that thing out, and we see how strong he's been. But the next time around, they're going to be very disciplined. And so we need to make sure that if we actually defeat the fascist threat, that we're building the power that is necessary to create a multiracial democracy. And that goes back to the people in this room being leaders in shaping public policy, in expanding democracy, and making sure that we have the full power that cannot be assaulted the way it has been these past 9 years.
Thank you, Steve. This group's been suffering from Steve fatigue, so part of the solution is to get a cooler Steve up on the stage. That was great, and I want to give you guys, if you all want to respond to that. I think one thing I just want to name is the power analysis that's necessary to the work we do. You know, and I think that's part of the challenge with philanthropy is that what each of you are describing is conceding of power to the people. And in philanthropy, money is often power. And when you just write a check for $30 million to an organization and say, you know best, that's saying, I am saying I am not the powerful person, Mackenzie Scott. I am saying, you have the power, here it is. And there's a power analysis in everything Initai Foundation is doing. Not surprisingly, led by your boss, a Native woman in philanthropy who's running a $2.5 billion shop. That's pretty good. We need more of that. There's even the power analysis that comes from being a grant maker on the ground. So I want to just name that, and Barkley and I were talking about this yesterday, that we're doing a lot of belonging work, but belonging without a power analysis is kind of hollow. And that's what Dennis Kieran told me, who's a smart grant maker at the Rakes Foundation, thinking about these things. So we have to bring a power analysis to this work. And I think part of what we're trying to do with young people is carve into this horrific 47% that Steve just hit on. And I wonder, just as we think about that, because that struck me, that if we have places, if we are able to flip the script that Dr. Pam Cantor presented to us, right? Because part of the takeaway from her plenary yesterday morning was like, oh my God, like we have designed these systems and structures in all the wrong ways, right? But if we change that, then we get to folks who want to participate in a multicultural democracy versus tear it down. And we get to leaders who don't double down on othering, but actually can see the power in belonging. So as you all think about your closing comments, and as you all think about questions you might have, let's see are there questions in the room? Because we're about to do Q&A. Good. We're about to go to Q&A. Are there reflections on Steve's reflection and additions that you want to make sure you talk about in response to the moment we're in right now in this country?
Did you guys want to start? Well, I'm happy to start. I mean, I would say everything that Steve just shared, which was super powerful, and everything that we've talked about so far, none of that was about a 2-year grant with objectives outlined clearly in advance, right? Like sitting here today, we don't know what's gonna happen next Tuesday. And so I think the data that, that I shared earlier, which was around like this powerful grant making, that wasn't all tied up in logic models and clear outcomes, but like giving people the flexibility to do what needs to be done, there's still there's strategy in that, right? And so I think it's important to hold on to like, we know what the practices are that can lead to change, and it's just important to actually move those in the way that we move funds around.
Any other quick reactions?
Yeah, I think, everything you said, I'm like, yes. I think for us, there was early on in our learning when we would meet with different organizations, we met with the Makah Nation, and if folks aren't familiar with the Makah Nation, they are in the the northwesternmost part of Washington State. And the chairman at the time, John Ide Sr., said, I want you to realize you both, it was me and Nicole, our CEO, and we were very new at that point, and he was like, at some point your organization's gonna get to be well known, you'll be very fancy, you'll be invited, actually probably to places like this. And he was like, I don't want you to forget that we are the ones who know what we need. And he was like, you're gonna get to a point where you're gonna forget it. And I try to remember that daily because and I'm sure for other funders in the room, it happens. You move into positions of power. I used to work in city government. It's true there. It's true in any institution you start to move in. You start to forget and you start thinking, I know all the things. I have this vantage point. I have a bird's eye view, yada, yada. And so I think for me and our organization, we come back to that a lot. And so, and it's strategic because of course, he knows what his community needs. And so every way we gear our strategies, it has to be hearing from them. How should we be moving this? What's the right way for us to support you? It doesn't mean walking away, it means accompaniment, but what does that look like? And then in terms of what Steve said, I think for us, we know after the election, even if we get the positive win, like it still means in Washington State, we have some of the most well-funded right-wing think tanks that spread racist ideology around the country, and that will continue. And so part of our job is, well, how do we look at how are we funding and making sure we're bringing other funders to all of the amazing work that's being happening, and how do we build up that infrastructure? Because this isn't gonna end. And so how do we keep resourcing that? I think those are the two things.
Any other? Okay, let's go to Q&A. We've got a mic, and if you have a question, raise a hand out there, and we'll tap into the wisdom of this amazing panel. One thing as we bring it, let's start there, is I'm struck that the challenges that each of us see connect to participation. It just, in the end, it really does come down a lot to participation. So it's pretty awesome that a young person from Pine Ridge can participate in philanthropy because of the infrastructure of the Native Americans in philanthropy. One fear I have is that philanthropy will take a step back. I mean, we are already seeing that, right? We're seeing that fear is causing the institutions that we're most dependent on for a vibrant democracy to step back. That, the Washington Post and the LA Times stepped back. They would not endorse a candidate for president this time around. We're seeing funders say, whoa, we can't use DEI language. I think as we get to our closing comments, I'd love to hear how you all think we can lean in, and also as you think in your closing comments, how do we, what's the recommendation for folks on the ground? Because either way, going forward, we need to keep building this really healthy, beautiful vision that could be America. But as the poet said, America never was America to me, but how do we make it America for us? Okay, first question.
Thank you so much for this fabulous panel, and thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing. Steve, I just want to say I read that article. I have it highlighted, dog-eared, underlined all the things. I passed it out to as many people as I could. I thought it was a terrific, terrific article, and it has definitely raised a lot of questions for us. So I'm from the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo, and I'm the Chief Community Impact Officer. And presently we are in the process of sort of reimagining our Racial Equity Roundtable, which was founded a full decade ago. And one of the things that we're trying to really grapple with is, are the strategies that we deployed over the course of the last decade making a meaningful difference? And if so, how are they making a meaningful difference? And I think the thing that we have to grapple with is, one question that your article has prompted us to put on the table and that I have been asking, if more people don't end up with more power, then what difference ultimately have we made? There has to be more power for more people. And I think that there are a couple questions I want to put to the panel in general about that. So question number one is, I'm finding that there is a uncomfortableness in discussions among our board or with others about the word power. And I would really, really, welcome your guidance on how to challenge that and to really invite an honest and authentic conversation about helping people build power over their lives. And then the second question is trying to understand what might be some of the strategies. I appreciate that the article talks about civic engagement and really trying to help build up civic infrastructure so that we are building more voter participation, et cetera. But if there were, grants in communities, like I have a vision of trying to give micro grants to block clubs to organize an agenda for their block club that they then take to their city council member as a specific, where we're not prescribing what they take. This is their opportunity to get organized, to do community organizing, to build power. And I have said, we as a funder have organized money. We should use our organized money so people can get organized to build power. And I just would invite any guidance on any of that.
Okay, who wants to start on that? Steve, you got called out in a very positive way, so we can start with you.
Well, just first really quickly on the Buffalo piece, so the head of the group showing up for racial justice, Aaron, is from Buffalo. So I would actually encourage trying to engage them in your work. I think that what's interesting, you're talking about people of color in the different positions, and then there's the Native grant makers piece. What's interesting about what you guys are doing in Washington is that it's not a Native American foundation, but it's run by a Native leader. Right, so ultimately, this is partly, I think, where we need to go, is that it's not just we have these separate things, but the big institutions need to be run by people of color. Just one specific thought to what you were raising. I heard I overheard somebody yesterday just kind of talking, they were talking about how they had gone to, had a community center, and they brought some people to the community center to ask the youth what should actually be the programmatic work that's going on, and they're trying to lift those lessons up and then take those to the city council. That to me is the essence of democracy. And then when we get to power, we have to take that kind of work from, we're gonna do that work, lift up the voices, the lessons from the community, and then try to convey that to the people in power, to have that be ultimately the starting point of those who are in power. Is that, and this concept of a people's budget. And so I think we have to move from, as advocates and community folks, looking for how do we get some percentage, just look at the whole entire budget. And let's a proposal around how we could actually redo that. And then linked to that is then also not just going to advocate for, and this was an experience I had in my own life. So I remember I was new to San Francisco, I was 27 years old, sitting in the back of the auditorium at the school board meeting, watching the new school board members being sworn in. And I thought, I could do that. And that gave me the confidence to actually go from working with this group, Black Men of Action, in the community and schools, to run for the school board, to be in a position to actually be one of 7 people deciding what was going to happen on a $400 million a year budget. So I would encourage all of the people in this room, and I said this at a commencement speech I gave, I have had the privilege, I don't know if it's a privilege, I've had the opportunity to interact with many of the wealthiest people in this country. I have sat with billionaires, I've been in these different rooms, and I know for a fact that it is the level of knowledge expertise, skill, and talent of the people in this room is greater than that of most of the billionaires that I have sat around tables with. And I would just want to imbue you with that confidence to then take that to contend for leadership within your cities and with your state, in your counties and within your states.
That's great. I do think it's true that many a billionaire was born on third base and thought they hit a triple.
And thinks they know everything.
Yeah, and thinks they know. And there's a trend in the private sector, like we made money in the private sector, so now we need to bring it to the social sector. And it's like, actually, most of what you're bringing doesn't work, and the social sector has a pretty rich history of very thoughtful practice. So speaking of thoughtful practice, I want to give each of you a chance to close. I don't think we have any other questions in the room. Okay, Joey, put a question mark on it and make it quick if you can, because we don't have much time, brother. Thank you. It's beautiful to see you.
And those billionaires on third were hitting our Dodger bullpen last night. Just to make it, just a little correction on the LA Times article, or the LA Times endorsement. They didn't endorse, not because they were scared, they endorsed for the administration's stance, Biden and Harris, on the genocide in Palestine. I'm from LA, that's why I went down. So I guess it leads into the other question. I've always told Geneva this when we've talked, is that I organized for 20 years on the ground, and in California, I wasn't organizing for a more comfortable plantation or a more comfortable reservation. We were organized to dismantle a system. And we heard Steve allude to that about our Interior Secretary, who's native in an unnative organization, department, right? Is it success for us to get in these high places inside the same colonial construct that came from Europe that was dysfunctional to now? But when do we begin to organize and fund and dream into this system dismantling that leads into this new place that a lot of us natives knew on October 10th, 1492? And a place we're trying to get back to. So I guess as a Native person, we've seen the worst of both administrations. How do we get out of bed with one administration, and how do we begin to move down that course with boldness and courage?
Thanks. I think I think take that and incorporate your own closing comments. Each of you has the opportunity to do that. But I'm glad that Joey hit on, because we talked a lot earlier, that's been a through line at this convening around freedom dreaming, undoing, but what are we gonna make, and making sure that we're hitting on both of those things. But this is it, you now have the license and the discretion to respond to what's the last thing you want to leave us with, how do we think about really building and creating the systems we want versus putting people at top who can be helping us incrementally get there. Who's ready? We'll just go, who's ready to close this baby out?
I can
All
go first.
right. Thank you, Deanna.
I guess I would just like to say that, and I guess just me reflecting on the community that I come from and thinking of the other indigenous communities, is that we're naturally, giving communities. Philanthropy is something that, it's a value of ours. And so just thinking of these communities that really need support, they already do the things that they need to do with or without the resources. We're gonna continue to gather, we're gonna continue to have our celebrations, our ceremonies, practice our way of life. But really, philanthropy, I think, has a very unique position to, I think, accelerate some of the solutions that we are seeking. Because like I said, I think, we're gonna try to do these things on our own. We know what we need, how to do them, but philanthropy is just so uniquely positioned to offer those resources where things might happen faster. And I mean, I say this because I think it's a reality, and I don't mean it to be super negative, but I think, we are coming up with the solutions, but maybe not at a faster pace. I think, with some of the things that our community faces, there's, there's really lives being lost. And I think that a lot of these nonprofits, these organizations, institutions, they offer a lot of opportunities, for people to get involved in different things. But I think culture is kind of one thing that is common across all of them, and culture is prevention. I truly believe that. And so I think programs like NYG is super important because culture was always at the forefront, and it's what we all had in common, even though all of us women came from, we was all studying different things. We all had really different interests, but our commonality was, trying to make culture strong, to kind of stop some of the, the things that we don't like to see.
I love that. Accelerate and double down on the healing power of culture. Who's next? Who else?
I'm happy to go next. I would circle back to this piece that came up around power, because I think that is super key and crucial to actually moving a different kind of change forward. And Eric Liu has done some great work around this, and I think one of the things that he knows that is important for us to hold on to is that often we talk about power as if it's a limited commodity, and some folks can have, if some people have a lot of it, other people have a little bit, but really we cede our power away when we think we don't have any. And so I would just argue that, even if we're in a foundation that doesn't want to talk about power, or we're in a community and we feel like we don't have any, that part of our work is to constantly be asking and questioning ourselves, like, how are we using our own power to make change, and how are we encouraging other folks to do that as well?
Great. Eric Liu, you are more powerful than you know. Isn't that one of his books?
Yes.
Great. All right, let's keep going down the line. Steve
yeah.
gets the last word.
On the same vein, I kind of did the question about how you move, kind of when you're working with your board or however to see power. For us, we saw over and over and again, and we keep seeing this, the further organizations that we meet with, or people who are just raising a ruckus or doing care in their community, they may not be funded as an organization, the further they're away from philanthropy, the more radical they're dreaming. Like, to your point, it's not just about, let me get into political office. It's like, here's this whole other way that we're living and that we're being. And so part of the work that my team does is actually bringing that to our board so that they can see that, and then us resourcing it. And so I think just to underline what you said in the audience about really seeing that it's not, there's putting people in political offices is great, but that's not enough. And so I think for us as funders, really saying, what's our role to fund those big dreams and those visions of what's possible, and us not to dictate that, but to put the resource out there because folks are already doing it, and think about how we really just help move that forward.
Yeah. And I just want to, well, one, thank all of you for all of your work, because this actually is the most important work. I've been on the side of doing the work, and I've been on the side of cutting the checks, and doing the work is harder. And so I just want to appreciate everybody who's here. I want to amplify this point about dreaming the big dreams, that the conclusion of my book, I talk about writing a new social contract, right? One of the things in terms of this normalization of what's happening is the extent to which the current social contract has been shredded, and starting with, do we accept the outcome of election results that we experienced in 2020, 2021, to putting mass deportations, to undoing the 14th Amendment, all of the Roe versus Wade and reproductive rights, all of these things that we thought were part of the social contract are being attacked and trampled on and destroyed. So what I try to argue in the conclusion of my book, well then let's write a new social contract. And let's write one that embodies our fullest hopes and dreams, and not a series of compromises with those who don't actually agree with us and want to destroy us. Why can't we have a society in the richest country in the history of the world that does not have poverty, right? Why can't we have the full vision of what we actually want to see? And one of the things that I would contend is that there is far greater appetite for that public policy agenda than most people in public office and in philanthropy appreciate. And so the radicalness of the attacks on the social contract open up a door for us to be able to be really, frankly, equally radical in terms of the beloved community that we have been fighting for all this time. So I would put that forward. And then lastly, I'll just end with a request and an invitation. So you mentioned DEI. So I'm working on my next book, which is in the context of these attacks on DEI, and really trying to re-ground us in the original proposition. And so I'm working with this framework of does all mean all? And so if we're saying all people are created equal and all people should have opportunity, and we have a society with glaring inequality, what are we doing about that? Because just 4 years ago, after George Floyd was killed, we seemed to care greatly about addressing inequality. And that has all been retreated from in the wake of all these attacks on DEI. But I want to be part of a movement that goes back on the offensive around reclaiming this notion around fighting for racial justice, taking the offensive around this, re-grounding on this proposition of making sure that we're working towards all being all. So I'm working on another book, and then we're going to roll this out monthly. I'm going to try to do monthly columns starting in January, looking at what did we promise after George Floyd was killed? Where are we now? And looking area by area, philanthropy, corporations, federal government, local government. So I would love to partner with anyone and everyone here around that effort to be able to go on the offensive in our respective areas and arenas to reclaim the momentum around creating the kind of society we want to see.
All right. Give it up one more time for this awesome panel. Thank you. All right. I'm sure they'll be hanging around so you can talk to them after. Thank you. Okay, we're almost done. We have 10 minutes left. If you guys want to, we're going to make room for Unspoken Bean, where he's at. Where's he at? Oh, I cannot articulate at that point. Thank you, guys. Okay, the last two things we're going to do, Unspoken Bean, bring us home, and then I'll just do a quick final, and then we're able to hang out here. We've got this space for another hour for folks who want to just hang out and connect and create the all that Steve is speaking to. All right, without further ado, here he is, the man from Houston.
I would like to, thank you, Steve. I would like to, my young people are at the airport, they're on the plane, they're nervous about the snow, they'll be all right. Yeah, I'm sending them good vibes, but how y'all welcomed them in, how y'all hugs them and let them know how good of a job that they did, how warm y'all were to them will always be 1,000 thank yous from me to you. Thank you for that. And also, they needed it. They needed it because in a lot of ways, that's not happening a lot for them, right? It's not happening a lot. And so for people who don't know them from Adam, to look them in the eyes and to see them and to show empathy to them and to let them know your words touched me and to quote their words back even if it was wrong. I'm not looking at you. But that will carry them. Some of you said that means so much. So thank you, right? Thank you, Aspen Institute, for having us. And this poem is I wrote it for, what's your name, sir? I wrote this poem for you. What's your name? Huh? Barklin? Barkley. I knew it started with a letter. I was so close. I wrote this poem for you, Barkley. Ben, I wrote this poem for you, man. I promise. Crystal, I wrote this poem for you. I wrote this poem for every single one of you. Every one of you people. People, we are the extraordinary. living among the ordinary who believe that ties don't tie the same around a white collar or blue. My class is not your homeroom. I am a match. I burn at both ends. I just don't burn for you. We are regular people. All my hair is a number that carry 10 digits in my pockets. I was given a pair to stare, and I wear them in my sockets. I am of person, not of people. We speak the same language, even when it's not the same language. That's when the universal language of body movement comes in. I use the same 10% of my brain as you do. I wanted to use the other 90 so I can soul to the guru. I woke up early in the morning to catch a 7:30 flight, flew halfway around the world and landed in the night, climbed halfway up the mountain, got halfway in the village. When I reached the guru, he touched me and replied, "You're merely a person. You may have been born on different days, but you're created the same way, of the same basis, using the same clay. You are regular people. We are regular people. You are the starving child and abandoned in Ethiopia. You're a rich kingdom, hoarding a cornucopia. You are people." Well, excuse me, Mr. Shaman. Man, I traveled a long distance to try to find some solutions, and now I found a man with all the answers. You only add into my confusion. I don't want to be just one of the people. No, I want to ride the elevator to the top until I have no equal. You see, that's where I've been, the top. It's cold, desolate, regrettable, yet unforgettable. I tug when you tug. As a reminder, the rope strands were once alive. When you're secluded, you die. You are, I am, we are. He is, she is, they are, you are. Free-floating molecules making up the body of the universe. You are the stanza, the mantra, the words, the free verse. Passports take months for you to see. So when you walk, you're a poem in motion. You are, I am, we are, seeds deeply rooted in the forest of poetry. Let my lips reach you. Read my knees and allow them to teach you. Gather your bones on the way to the summit. Toss them, let them delete, then plummet into the depths of one's soul as you travel your way on top of the mountain. You see, y'all, while you were on your way up, right? While you were on your way up, I was on my way down. That's how we met at the middle, because you can't figure out the riddle. That's the way to escape people. To become the people. So at least speak to the people. You don't have to agree with the people. Have you met them? You know how people be. You show them the truth, but you know how people see. You teach them good morals, but they may still choose impurity, so just choose. Choose, choose, choose. What is your choice? Don't worry about your flaws subsequently. We're all equal, and I heard your people can build Babel-like towers. And I heard your people, craftsmen of steeples, together our people can build cathedrals one person at a time. Because we are all regular.
Thank you, man. Thank you. So, yeah, that's fun to follow. Thanks, Bean. He'll be around to sign Steve's book later if y'all, no, I just want to thank you for that. It's a great way to close with actually the art and the call. And I think this whole gathering has felt more like a call to action than any we've had, and maybe that's because of the moment we're in this country right now. Has a lot to do with the speakers who brought it, and I want to thank everybody over the last several days for those who shared, but also those who actively listened. Thank you. Really want to acknowledge the Aspen team. Thank you, Aspen team. What an incredible job. So a lot of them are trying to beat the snow as well, but what Monique has pulled off, Yelena, there's Mona, the folks who have really, Geneva, the folks who have, I can name all of them, but those are the folks have been working hard, as you know, to pull this off, and I think they did a great job curating this gathering, so shout out to them. Usually, Monique and I do a long reflection. Monique has all these deep insights that are super cool, so we'll save those for when we're together next in LA, May 19th to the 23rd. Put in your calendars now. We're going to LA. We're going to have a party at Joey's place. It's going to be good. And I just want to end with encouraging some of the stuff we heard about the power and the importance of rest, because I think one takeaway for me is that this is long haul work, And so while stakes are high next week and there's a lot of anxiety, we're still here, you know. The UROC community's triple, quadruple, what's 8 times in size? They got bigger over the course of this, despite all of the barriers. So it was powerful to hear that at the very opening of this gathering. So we're getting bigger as a movement, as a part of a larger movement for the kind of just world that we all work for. But take care of yourselves. Remember that part about well-being starts with yourselves, that we can't create systems of healing without doing that work ourselves. So that's my last charge to you all as we have formally adjourn and prepare to travel home to loved ones. Do the self-care work, and rest. And I hope you're leaving maybe tired, but with full hearts and full minds. And until next time, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.